Good afternoon. Mark Taylor, time to sit down. Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Terry Goddard. I'm the president of the Central Arizona Project, and it's my pleasure to be here to walk us through. I said it was my pleasure, maybe it's just my duty, to walk us through the current situation in Arizona regarding water, and specifically our water supply from the Colorado River that comes through the CAP to Central Arizona. I'm here on behalf of the CAP Board of Directors, which is, as I'm sure most, if not all of you know, a popularly elected board from the three Central Arizona counties, Pima, Canal, and Maricopa. And we have the duty of making sure that one of the longest ditches in the world stays wet, and that we do everything we can to make sure that Arizona benefits from that water, which is a miracle. Now, as again, if you were with us at lunch or perhaps just from the news, you already know that just a few days ago, the Secretary of the Interior did what we had anticipated she would do for a long time, declared a shortage on the river, a Tier 1 shortage, basically saying that Lake Mead had dropped to a level which meant that very stringent cutbacks would be necessary. And because of the priorities on the river, those cutbacks all fall in the first round against the Central Arizona Project. Now, for municipal, and 1/3 of the total amount of water that normally comes in the CAP Canal next year, 2022, will not be there. It will stay in Lake Mead, or we hope it'll stay in Lake Mead. We hope there'll be that much. But that's the beginning news. I guess the good news about a Tier 1 shortage for municipal officials is that at Tier 1, no city or town or tribal entity is going to suffer cutbacks. The agricultural community will suffer some very severe cutbacks. They're going to have to be much more efficient, and they're going to have to go back to a significant amount of groundwater pumping. That's a second issue that we're probably not going to deal with here today, but it's an important one. So we've had the Tier 1, and I guess the message before we get to the panel is that's a wake-up call. Hopefully everybody sees that not as the end of the story, but of the beginning of a change in Arizona that's going to have to be much more frugal about our water resources. We're going to have to turn a corner here and find ways at cities, towns, and personal activities that we can be more careful about this precious resource that we have in smaller and smaller quantities. And with that, I would like to turn to a panel here to discuss how it is that Arizona and cities and towns in Arizona can deal with, I don't want to use the word crisis, but with a water emergency, something that we all have to put our best efforts into trying to solve. And just as a quick aside, Arizona has a rich history of doing just that. Throughout our heritage, since statehood, we've done an incredible job of meeting these challenges. This is a new one, but I'm very confident that it's one that we will be able to meet. Now, I know there's some CAP board members here, and Mark Taylor, our vice president, was walking around talking to too many people a minute ago. But Mark, would you raise your hand? And Jennifer Brown is here. Where did you go? All right, well, maybe she's had to leave. But we have our board members strategically salted throughout the group here, and hopefully you can turn to them if you have urgent questions that aren't answered by this panel. Now, the league has said that we only have an hour. I know we're the only thing between all of you and the next round, which I believe involves adult beverages, and so we're gonna skip the normal mandatory opening remarks. I'm gonna go right to some questions, and we're definitely gonna have time for audience questions. So please be thinking about what you'd like these folks to deal with. First on my left is not the person whose name is on the card, unfortunately. He had a COVID test that he's waiting on, but Clint Chandler is the Deputy Director of the Arizona Department of Water Resources and is standing in for the director today. Ted Cooke is the General Manager of the Central Arizona Project. To the left, or to your right from Ted is Jessica Marlow, Public Works Director of the town of Gilbert, and John Kmiec is the Water Director of the city of Tucson. So here we have, I think, from the state level and from the local level, some real expertise. And I would like to start with asking John and Jessica to tackle what does a Tier 1 shortage mean for your city, in this case Gilbert and Tucson, and its residents. And if you can't answer that question, we'll go right to the next one.
We'd have bigger problems if we can't answer that question. Good afternoon, everybody. Greetings from Tucson. So I'll start on what a Tier 1 shortage actually means to the city of Tucson and the area around Tucson that we serve. Tucson, as many you know, has a unique history when it comes to water. Our history is more than 50 years now that we've known that water is a critical resource in the Tucson community. We had over-pumped our groundwater system in the Tucson Basin for many decades of the 20th century, and one of the reasons that Tucson ended up with one of the largest CAP allocations for municipal and industrial contract is because we were a 100% groundwater dependent system. We did not have any other surface waters in Tucson. It was strictly groundwater. So Tucson ended up with 144,191 acre feet of M&I contract water from CAP. And that helped to make sure that we weren't going to have subsidence continue to occur in the Tucson region and around the area in general. One of the other thing that Tucson did back about 50 years ago is they knew, as I mentioned, that water was critical. They actually purchased over 22,000 acres of farmland west of Tucson and retired that agricultural use for future groundwater rights. So a combination of moving forward with CAP, moving forward with purchasing and getting as much groundwater rights as possible, as well as by the 1980s becoming one of the first reclaimed water major purveyors in the state of Arizona to use non-potable water. So the history of Tucson's knowledge and the people growing up with Tucson about how critical water is has been present for decades. So when we look at what a Tier 1 shortage means to our city and our residents, as Terry mentioned, having that M&I contract doesn't really mean a lot right now, but it is a wake-up call. We incorporated into our drought preparedness plan the tiers identified with Lake Mead because CAP water is our critical resource. It's our primary resource coming in as we reserve those other groundwater systems for future use. And having that Tier 1 shortage is going to allow us to do more enhanced conservation messaging throughout our community to make everyone in Tucson who are already aware and have a very strong conservation ethic even more knowledgeable about their urban water cycle and where the water comes from that supports southern Arizona. So enhanced messaging is going to be a big role for us, even though we're going to continue to take our full allocation. I should mention only 2/3 of our full allocation right now is used on an annual basis. We actually bank in the aquifer in Avra Valley 1/3 of our CAP allotment every year. And even under a Tier 1 shortage, we will still be getting our full allocation and still be able to bank that CAP water in the that extra CAP water in the aquifer for future Tucsonans. So that's a message we've been putting out there and a message we will continue to put out there. But a Tier 1 shortage is a wake-up call for everybody, not only in the Tucson region, but the state of Arizona.
Now, John, I was born in Tucson, so I don't want to say that you're the paragon of water conservation. But what is the per capita use? I know there are many different ways to figure it, but my recollection is it's pretty good and it's worth emulating.
It's I think the last count is just under 100.
Under 100?
Yeah.
Great. Jessica.
So, yes, Gilbert's history is a little bit different. John mentioned that the CAP is their primary source. CAP is not our primary source. Our M&I contract is only about 10% of our total water supply. We have SRP, we have our groundwater, we have reclaimed that we've also been actively recharging and 100% reusing since the 1980s. So for us as well, the Tier 1 shortage doesn't mean a lot to our residents other than, as John mentioned, a lot of additional education and outreach, and not just on conservation conservation, but on the water resources and what makes that up, so that they have more of a familiarity of all the different supplies we have available to us and how it gets to them, and maybe better appreciation for the amount of work that goes into providing them that water source every day, so that when we do ask them to conserve, they're maybe a little more amenable to that. We have a great water conservation team and a really creative digital government team that does a lot of social media outreach. We've already started putting how-to videos together on how to, everything from read your water meter to how to detect if you have a leak in your soft water system to how do you find a leak in your irrigation system. And so just to continue to provide a lot of that education and outreach to our community, going into preparing us for potential future short or cuts. The other thing it will see is an increased cost for the delivery of the cap water, and that's something that we're going to have to figure out how to address, either absorb or incorporate into future rate structures.
And hasn't Gilbert done a pretty spectacular job of public amenities that are actually groundwater recharge or
we have, yes, we just
basically glorifying what we're doing to try to save water?
Exactly. Our riparian preserve just had its 20-year anniversary, and it was built as a recharge facility, but it has hundreds of thousands of visitors a year with trails and bird watching and astronomy, everything. So we've really tried to put that in the forefront of our water reuse, in Gilbert.
Well, the previous panel was on tourism in rural Arizona, and I just want to emphasize that water conservation may actually have some very important recreational and tourist benefits that may not have been exploited perhaps enough. Well, Clint, I've got one for you. How does the state of Arizona participate in the discussions with others involved in the Colorado River, including other states, the federal government, tribes, and Mexico?
Thanks, Terry. As consumers of the news, most of you are aware that on August 16th, the Bureau of Reclamation provided the August 24-month study, and as Terry indicated, that included the first ever shortage declaration, but also of considerable significance at that time was the arrival with the 10th percentile projection at or near, very near elevation 1030, which affects basically a provision in the Lower Basin Drought Contingency Operations Agreement that's part of the DCP. It's one of the adaptive measures that's included in the Drought Contingency Plan that was agreed in 2019. And that, in turn, effectuates a consultation process to protect elevation 1020. And elevation 1020 is an alarmingly low elevation. There are a number of implications for that. And so in this context, we've commenced those consultations. We had a meeting just this week. We hosted at DWR with the other Lower Basin representatives. And so there's going to be considerable work. And one of the reasons why we identified that 10th percentile instead of what's known as the most probable, which is close to the median, is we wanted to provide that time and space with which to work. Yet I also want to emphasize, we did want that room to work, but we also have a sense of urgency. And so we're having those conversations with our peers in other states. CAP is very much involved with that. DWR, Director Buschatzke is the Arizona principal, the governor's representative, but Ted is right there with him and had a lot of status and stature, and the peer agencies in California and Nevada are represented in those conversations. We have meetings calendared all the way through to the end of the year. We have Lower Basin meetings, we have 7 states meetings. So we're going to be working through a lot of difficult issues. I mean, these are not easy challenges to surmount, but we've had some really meaningful conversations just within the Arizona team, and I think very encouraging discussions. And so, the next few months. It will be the push and pull and give and take, but there's going to be a lot of endeavoring to get where we need to go to protect against those, to protect to the extent that we can against those lower reaches, against those declines. Regarding tribal outreach, and we were proceeding along with the Arizona Reconsultation Committee, so we were looking at what occurs at the end of the interim period, what happens in 2026 and subsequent to the operating rules that are now in place. And so we were working through that, and we had to we moved to this adaptive measure with the DCP, but we still have the reconsultation process, which includes our steering committee, our reconsultation committee, which has tribal representation. I think Arizona has a very good story to tell about inclusion, stakeholder participation, and a subset of that is our strategy work group, and that includes, and it's somewhat more closely held because we discuss Arizona's negotiating position vis-a-vis the other states, and you don't want that all just out in the open. But tribes are well represented on that panel as well. The Gila River Indian community and the Colorado River Indian tribes are part of that group, and we've been talking to them. And then at the federal level, the United States has its own process of engagement. We're working with them, meeting with them regularly. They were part of the 7 states meeting that we had last month, and then they also have their separate lane, process to engage the tribes. There's quite a bit more, but I think that's all I have time to.
There is a lot to it. Everybody's got the lingo down, I'm sure. DCP, ARC, CAP, it keeps going. But one thing Clint said just then is the trigger, and I know we're all worried. We all think that this is something that has to have urgent attention. And part of the trigger that he just referred to is the rule that was put in the DCP that if at any time the worst case scenario, let me emphasize that, the 10% likely scenario, not the most likely, not the best, the worst one, if that hits a projection that Lake Mead will hit 1030, then we have to go into the discussions that Clint just described. So it's not a prediction, it's simply a wake-up, it's a warning. And I think it's right and appropriate that Arizona is within our own resources and within the basin looking at, okay, if Lake Mead gets to 1030 and it's only one prediction, one 10% prediction that says it will, what do we do then? Because that is even more of an emergency that we're dealing with now, because the lake will fall fast when it gets to that level. But let's get back to municipal issues and what cities can do. I'd like to ask John and Jessica, how does your city encourage conservation, assuming you do, and what, if anything, can individual citizens do to help to solve this problem? I know as mayor, I did a lot of low-flow shower heads, and I still hate them, but I think they help.
Yes. So I think the most important thing that Gilbert does to encourage conservation is just to provide our residents so many tools and resources to make conservation easy and straightforward. We have, like I mentioned before, workshops and resources teaching people how to, set their irrigation timer or calculate their water usage online. We have a really great water calculator that we shared with AMWA that, you can put in everything that is specific to you, and it tells you how much water you should be using. And if you're using more than that, we'll come out to your house. We'll do an audit. We'll help you figure out where you're using the water and whether, you can make adjustments to improve that. During COVID, we started doing virtual water audits so that we didn't have to go to people's houses, but we could still walk them through the process. We do have some incentive programs. We have, irrigation smart controller giveaways for high water usage, but we've typically focused a lot of our conservation efforts on the non-residential because that's where you get more kind of bang for your buck when you talk about high water use HOAs and commercial properties and trying to be responsible with the funds that we're using in order to encourage that conservation, but seeing a positive positive return on how much water is actually being saved. But I do think that, the further we get down the line, the more cost-effective those conservation programs will be for the residents, because the water will get more expensive. We do have tiered rates that, the more you use, the more you pay. But I think really what we do is just try to really engage our citizens in a variety of different ways and provide them a lot of great resources and tools and information in order to help them conserve and use water effectively.
And how receptive are your residents to those messages?
I think they're really receptive. We have, when we do our social media, different posts and things, everything we get is positive. Nobody's complaining about why are we trying to encourage conservation. We've always been.
You haven't talked to any golf course owners lately.
Well, our that's one of the things with us. Our golf courses and a lot of our large HOA users use reclaimed water. They don't use potable water, and so that's really helpful. And we encourage conservation, by really leading by example. As we go forward into potential future cuts and conservation requirements, the town's not going to ask the residents to do anything that we aren't going to do first. And so they see us, putting in the low flow fixtures and reducing our watering in our different facilities, and just trying to be a good example and good steward of the resources that we have.
Great. John? Tucson doesn't need to, right?
No. We're very strong with conservation. Tucson and Gilbert have a lot of mature programs that Jessica just mentioned when it comes to conservation programming. We also have appliance rebates and toilet rebates as well. But some of the other things that we're doing in Tucson that's a little different and a little unique is we just started a few years ago a green stormwater infrastructure program. It's a fee that our mayor and council have adopted to help green up some of the spaces using natural rainfall as the conservation, as the feature water source on that. So Tucson is looking for those other areas to get rid of that heat island effect, actually make the standard of living higher by greening up throughout our community with that green stormwater infrastructure program. The other thing I wanted to mention, and Jessica mentioned in Gilbert as well, is we have our Zanjeros program. That's what we call them in Tucson. Those are the employees that any of our customers can call to do the water audits at their house, and they can help troubleshoot any reasons why they think they might be using more water than they anticipated using, or just to help them find other ways to conserve on their property. Many of you know, though, but the difference in the Tucson area compared to, let's say, the Phoenix area is our community got away from turf on the residential side as much as possible. So Tucson's a very desert adapted community, xeriscaping programs and planting native vegetation, native trees throughout the community is one of our ethics down there, and one of the reasons our water use has been so low over the past few decades. And if I can leave you guys with one thing about Tucson and why conservation is so critical, and we think of conservation as part of our water resource portfolio. Tucson used in 2020 just over 100,000 acre feet of water was our total demand. In 1990, it was the same, except we have 200,000 more residents now compared to where we were 30 years ago. Most of that is attributable to conservation and the change in the ethic throughout our community to be desert adaptive. Understand that our programs with our K through 12 in the school district, teaching about the urban water cycle in Tucson and how important it is to be conscious about the water use. We see that reflected in the total water use, where we can demonstrate that over the last 30 years that we really haven't increased from where we were, but we gained 200,000 more customers.
Hey, round of applause. Can we give them a little salute? That is impressive. Let me ask Ted Cooke, going back to the state level, even the basin level, what will happen if the reservoirs continue to dip, continue to fall? And do you believe that they will?
Well, unless the drought suddenly ends, which is unlikely, I do believe that the reservoir levels will continue to fall without further action. I think that's the important word there. Before I finish answering the question, I would like to add a couple of comments to what Mr. Chandler said about how does the state of Arizona work with the other states and the United States and the tribes and so forth. And just point out that that the 1030 consultation, which is the answer to this question, which is what if the reservoirs continue to fall, and I'll come to that in just a second. We've got the 1030 consultation that just got triggered. Clint mentioned there's the reconsultation, which is the process that will design the new program that comes in and replaces the 20-year program called the 2007 guidelines. It's going to expire in 2026. That needs work. We have the implementation of the first ever Tier 1 shortage that's been going on all this year in anticipation of being implemented next year. We have other provisions of the drought contingency plan in the upper and lower basin that have to be implemented. We're anticipating that a Tier 2 shortage may arrive as early as 2023, even though it's about a toss-up whether that will happen in 23 or 24. And then Tier 3 after that. So my point is there's a lot going on, but we don't wait until there's an emergency to be working with these people, whether it's the United States, the tribes, the other states, water users throughout the basin. We're working with them all the time, even on things like the accounting of the use on the river every year for carrying out the operating plan of deliveries. We're working with these people all the time. So having the 1030 trigger come, even though we knew this might come sometime, and it's not good news when it does happen, the prospect of having to now start this new conversation is not a daunting thing. The work that needs to be done is daunting, but the conversation and the relationships are already there with those people because we work with them all the time. We just got done doing DCP with these people, and now we're going to start in on something else, not to replace that, but in parallel with the other things that are happening. So with respect to what if the reservoirs continue to go lower, well, we're at a Tier 1. It is a wake-up call. It's the single biggest step as far as reduction goes for Arizona. California will come in a Tier 2 at some level. That for the first time ever, they will participate in these programs, not because they have to, but because they realize that we're all in this together, and they can't just ride on their senior priority and say, we're fine, you guys take care of the problem. So there is a Tier 2 and a Tier 3 that comes after Tier 1 to help to continue to put more water in the lake if the levels continue to go lower. And then there is this adaptive provision that Clint talked about, which is what if Tier 1 and Tier 2 and Tier 3 isn't enough? And what happens if it keeps going down after that? And that's why this 1030 consultation is so important. If any time in the next 2 years of projection, at the minimal possible projection, so the worst one, indicates that we might reach 1030, then we have to get together and determine what else are we going to do. And that what else will not be, well, let's just tack Tier 4 onto the end of Tier 3. Because by the time you get to Tier 3 elevations in Lake Mead, it's probably not going to be possible to do the amount that will need to be done after that happens. So we're going to insert basically whatever comes out of this 1030 consultation, which is leave more water in Lake Mead. That has to be what it is. That's the only knob we have to turn. We can't say, turn up the snow knob. No, that's not going to work. We have to say, turn up the conservation knob. Leave more behind. And that will be inserted as soon as we can do it, maybe even before Tier 2 gets triggered. And doing those kind of things might even push Tier 2 out by a year and Tier 3, depending on what it is that we come up. But like Clint said, it just got triggered, even though we work with these people all the time. We're just starting to have that conversation, but we have a goal of having a plan put together very, very short, in the very short term, because time matters. When we only have 2 or 3 years to get something done, every month that goes by is very valuable amount of time that we need to identify what we can do as quickly as possible and start doing it as quickly after that as we can.
Now, we have floods in central Arizona right now. Does that help with the CAP crisis?
Well, floods maybe not. They don't. As a matter of fact, we did have some damage to our canal in Pinal County because of a 200-year rain event a couple of weeks back. But the question about does the precipitation help is kind of a mixed message. Actually, some of that water is captured in our canal and captured in our reservoir, and so in that sense, it does boost our supply a little bit. But it's an order of magnitude different than the quantity of water that we need to be left in Lake Mead. Also, when it rains, it suppresses some of the demand, particularly for irrigation. The temperatures cool down. People don't use as much water. They turn off their irrigation systems on their yard and things like that. And it does replenish the ground just a little bit. So it's helpful, but Lake Mead is upstream. So local precipitation doesn't really help that issue. But locally it helps and can aid with conservation.
Well, my reason for asking is that exactly what you said at the end, that this is a big basin. Colorado comes from Wyoming down to Mexico. And what generates water for Lake Powell and Lake Mead is snow in the Rockies. And we've had some lousy winters lately. Anybody who's a skier knows that. And the result is the very, very low flow into Lake Powell. In fact, it's the lowest flow in history, the second lowest flow in history. And that has reaped very significant problems in terms of the lake levels. So snow, if anybody has a particular way of dialing up snow in the Rockies, please try that knob before any of the others. Let me get back to John and Jessica. I presume you're thinking now about what you're going to tell your residents about the shortage. Are there any plans afoot right now in either Tucson or Gilbert to do some extra publicity because of the Tier 1?
Yeah, Terry, we've actually been talking about shortage for years in Tucson. So a lot of our residents and those who pay attention to what's happening with the water supply.
I'm getting a little tired of this holier than thou attitude from Tucson.
We try very hard, and we have good intentions. Yeah, so we've been educating, and what you mentioned was very important. What you said a few minutes ago. We remind people that live in southern Arizona, we live in a desert. But our water supply is dependent upon the basin. So it's not how much it rains in Tucson, it's how much it snows in Colorado, which is what we watch from a hydrologic standpoint and the health of our incoming water resources. So we do explain what shortage is. Well, we have been explaining that for a long time, so they know that our CAP allotment is not going to be cut because of where we are as our contract. But they do understand that it's very important that they stay mindful of what their use is, not only at home, but what their use is at their business or work, and everybody works together to try to extend Tucson's resources as long as possible.
We haven't talked about shortage quite as much, probably, in a holistic manner. And so we're definitely working on additional outreach and education. I mentioned before we have a workshop planned in a few weeks to just educate our community on all of the different water resources that we have and can really demonstrate exactly what a shortage is on the CAP and who it affects and at what level and how it affects us directly. So we fully plan to heighten that message as we move forward and have a lot of great resources and things planned for that. But it's hard to explain when you say it's not going to affect us right now, so don't worry about it. And trying to kind of minimize the knee-jerk reaction and not send everybody into panic mode, but just educate them on really the what the short and longer term effects are.
Great, thank you. Well, let me pick on both Tom and Clint, Ted and Clint, because there's been reference that there's just not enough water in the river. What can we do about that? What are the augmentation plans that you're talking about at DWR? And how, for example, if we do salinity, desalting in the Bay of Cortez, how does that get to central Arizona? Because the last time I checked, the Gulf of Baja California is quite a long way away.
Well, augmentation is not easy, but there are some very encouraging efforts to report. And, as Terry alluded, there is the binational process that is part of it. It's an extension of Minute 323, which was effectuated in 2017. And we're working with the Republic of Mexico to explore desalination opportunities, as Terry indicated, in the Sea of Cortez. Director Buschatzke is the United States co-chair. They had a contracting team comprised of both United States and Mexico participants that produced a report that's on the IBWC website that was produced in June of last year. And it is, again, it's encouraging. It has, envisions approximately 100,000 to perhaps 200,000 acre feet that could be produced by different plants there in the Sea of Cortez region, or right there along the sea. So I think there's much promise. It's had a little bit of a pause since there's been some turnover in Mexico and some changes on the United States side with the change in administrations, but we're anticipating those conversations will resume soon. And how that might result in water flowing down perhaps the CAP Canal, that could occur through an exchange. So they're evaluating different possibilities, different permutations. And like I said, they had the report in 2020, and then they're starting the process for a subsequent report that will evaluate and work through some of there are many things that need attention with this, and so it's going to work on like rights of way, power, and things that weren't resolved with the first phase. But it is contemplating exchanges, pipelines, and it's the primary methods through which that could happen. And then I'll let Ted talk about the regional recycling water project. That's something that DWR and CAWCD have expressed an interest in participating in. It's a California effort that also would knock loose water in the Colorado River system through an exchange. Ted, if you want to take that.
That's a good segue. And first, let me illustrate. Maybe I'll use my hands a little bit. As for Colorado River users, and of course the CAP is entirely run on Colorado River water, so that's our sole source. So for us and others that rely on Colorado River water, we're experiencing this decline in the amount of Colorado River water that is available to us. And so we are working on things like desalination and some of the other things that I'll add in just a minute, while our Colorado River source continues to decline. And so we need to do some of the things that we've talked about earlier as far as leaving more of that behind to preserve that system and sustain it so we can keep using it into the future. Eventually, some of these other activities like desalination will come online, but it takes a long time, and it's very, very expensive. What do we do in the meantime? So that's kind of what I would like to add to this conversation. And Clint pushed me off in a good direction, which is what I'll call reuse, to use a general term. So there are a number of projects like the regional recycled water program that is actually going to take place in California, but that CAP and ADWR and actually Southern Nevada Water Authority are participating in, and it is to recycle some of the treated effluent that is discharged into the ocean right now, and say, isn't there a way that we can stop doing that and keep that water and use it over and over and over again? Matter of fact, in Arizona, we don't have an ocean to discharge into. None of our water makes it back into from the interior of the state back to the ocean. It's all consumed within the state, but not necessarily in the most beneficial way. It's left to percolate into the ground and maybe in a place where it can't be recovered or used by the lowest priority water user that exists. So there's lots of room in Arizona for reuse, and that's very broad, very broad category of reuse. Within individual homes and businesses and things like that, you may have heard of Purple Pipe. That's basically is a separate water system for wastewater or gray water that you can use. And these two would be much more experts on that stuff than I am. But I'm just making the point. There's lots of capacity for reuse. And some folks might get picky and say, well, that's not really augmentation. You're not adding to the supply. Well, but we're using the supply that we have and stretching it to go further. So that is an important thing. There's also what I'll refer to as recovery. And I think President Goddard mentioned this, and Clint may have mentioned it as far as recovery. So we've stored lots of water underground in Arizona when we had surplus supplies that were not needed for direct delivery, and we saved millions of acre feet underground. Well, the time has come to start figuring out, and it's not like we're just starting now. This is not one of those things, oh darn, we need to start working on that. But we do need to accelerate our effort to recover those supplies that have been stored underground. Strictly speaking, is that augmentation? No, but it's a supply that's not in use now, so it does basically augment the supply. Continued conservation is important. Every citizen, as we said before, that gives flexibility to your water provider. You're all from cities, so you understand what that means. If every mom and pop and every business is taking out their turf or putting in these low-flow devices and things like that, then it's not quite as tight of a situation for the water provider as far as having some room to maneuver and to maybe do some of this underground storage and things like that. And then there's big conservation, which is things like taking a farm out of production for a year, usually needed to be compensated to be willing to do that, but that's conservation too. And that helps in two ways. It reduces the consumption, and it allows us to leave some water behind in Lake Mead. Those are the kind of things that are going to happen between this declining supply and when augmentation is ready. What do we do in the meantime? It's those kind of things that we do in the meantime to kind of fill that gap. Augmentation, reuse, recovery, conservation.
The four big ones. Now, I hope everybody in this audience appreciates the historic nature of Ted's first comment about a partnership with Metropolitan Water in Los Angeles. You know, I grew up when the worst thing you could say in Arizona was that anything you did would profit California. In 1964, the decision was ruled by the Supreme Court in Arizona v. California. In many ways, we won that lawsuit. It was 10 years in the making. And this has been a battle that has divided us in the lower basin for my entire lifetime, all of yours. But now we're talking with the enemy. And I think it's a good example of how the lower basin is coming together, recognizing a mutual issue on the Colorado River and trying to find ways to solve it. And that's a huge example of doing just that. In other words, if Met is able to find a way with our help to purify their city water that's now being dumped in the bay and put that into productive use, that's 200,000 acre feet they're not taking from the Colorado River. And that kind of exchange really could help immeasurably, but it takes a lot of work and a lot of time to put them together. Now, Ted, last time I checked, next year, 512,000 acre feet, 1/3 of the capacity of the CAP will not be there. So that's a lot of reserve capacity. What are you going to do with it?
That's a good question, and just to clear up one thing in that regard that some people may read in the newspaper, because I've read it in the newspaper. Maybe it will take a half-full CAP canal to wake people up that we need to do something. The canal will never be half full. It'll always be full. It'll just be going slower. So just think that.
So it's velocity,
slower,
not
lower.
size.
Slower, not lower. But that's a great question, and once again, Clint alluded to this a little bit, which he mentioned exchange. So if we're a partner, if Arizona's a partner with California and Nevada on their regional recycled water program, and they save this water and use that locally in California and don't use as much of their Colorado River supply. How do we get that? Well, we don't build a pipeline. We use the Colorado River. It's already there. They were going to take water out of it. Now they're not, so we do instead. That's an exchange. What if we build a desalination plant in Mexico and we pay for part of it? And so we own some of that water. We say, Mexico, why don't you use this on your crops in Sonora and Baja California and Norte? And we'll take part of your Colorado River apportionment that normally we'd send down the river to you. We've got awesome plumbing in Arizona. It's called the CAP Canal. We have one interconnect with the Salt River Project going one way, and we're working on building one going the other way so that we can move supplies around within Arizona. So the good news is we already have this plumbing, and in 2017, the CAP Board of Directors approved an agreement with the United States called the System Use Agreement, which establishes the rules that allows us to put something else in the CAP, which is a federal facility that's not CAP project water. But the capacity is there. We're allowed to do it. That's been in our agreements with the U.S. since the beginning. But now there's a second, more recent agreement that outlines exactly how that happens. So we're ready to do that almost. There's a couple of steps so that when these new supplies come available, there's a place to get it to where it needs to go.
Great. Well, Clint, I'll leave this to you as a sort of a wrap-up. And a lot of the points have already been made as to how does Arizona counter the narrative that we're running out of water. But at DWR, how are you doing that?
Well, Terry, that's a very stark statement. A month ago I was on a panel, and the name of the panel was, "What are we going to do when the river runs dry?" And I made it clear from the very beginning, I did not have any input on how that was characterized, how that was titled.
There's a song that says that.
Right. And I know that sometimes that's how people express things. Sometimes the mind races to the very worst that could happen. But it's a complex answer. I think we have a very good story to tell. We have a long legacy of leadership, and that's something we've been emphasizing for years, and surmounting these kind of challenges. We had Bruce Babbitt, my former boss John Kyle, Stan Turley, and so many others that helped to bring Arizona to where we are now with the status that we have now. And so we have a long, encouraging track record that we can continue to benefit from. And just even more recently with the DCP, that was, the Arizona stakeholders coming together to help to cultivate the ground so that could pass the Arizona legislature. We were the only state that required legislative approval. You had 7 states in the United States cohering to enable the benefits of collective action. And that was a hard, heavy lift, but we did that. And
you got a bill through Congress in 7 days?
Yes, that's right, Terry. Very good point. Very, very good point. It just sailed through the Congress. I think it passed with UC, unanimous consent in the Senate, and maybe just a very few dissenting votes in the House. It sailed through the House. And so, but what made that happen, what helped to prepare the way was a lot of exertions before, with just the states, those relationships, across the basin and within Arizona. So again, we do have the track record, and that's something to feel very good about. Again, though, more broadly, the situation is complicated. There are uncertainties. I like to pay attention to how things are expressed. My first job was as a wordsmith on Capitol Hill in my early 20s. So I like to look at how people say things, and as the circumstances shift, the expression shifts. And just recently, the Bureau of Reclamation did something very different. They issued a 5-year probability table in an off month. They usually send that out in January, April, and August, but because of the rapid decline in the inflows, 1.4 million acre feet between April and June, they felt compelled to run the numbers again in July and put out those probabilities. In the press release, Wayne Pullen, who's the Upper Basin Regional Director, said it is a serious situation. I thought that is the first time I've ever seen anything in a press release from the federal government in the United States saying that this is a serious situation on the river. I did a little bit of polling, and everyone that I discussed this with, including some that have been at the high-ranking levels of Interior, said, yes, this is a departure. This has significance. So it is it's a complex situation. There are issues that require our attention, But there are also things that we can feel very good about. You know, Ted referred to the recovery. He's talking about a program that's been in existence since 1986 that's allowed us to put water in the ground. We have 13 million acre feet in underground storage, about 4 million acre feet of which is in the account of the Arizona Water Bank, which supports many of your municipalities. And so near term, intermediate term, I think we're very well situated. We're well situated. Near term, we're very, very well situated. You know, the further out you go, we'll see what occurs with hydrology. You know, we still are preparing. You know, there's a lot to, I think, to commend our situation, and so there's a lot of nuance, but I think overall, you know, we've been well prepared, and we're continuing to prepare for the road ahead.
Great, thanks, Clint. And I promised time for questions. We've got some standing mics back there. I'm sure that something that's been said has stimulated a question, a concern, a comment, a criticism, or how this can actually work in the future. So I would hope that if you could use the mic, it would be great, but I'll call on individuals too okay, we have somebody at the mic. Yes, sir.
In Israel, I understand that they're getting a significant amount of their water from desalination. Could we get to that point, and what would it cost?
You refer to the Israel example?
Yes, I am.
Yes. I think, Ted, you've got some of that information, or Clint?
Well, yes, a little bit. To expand on what Clint said a while ago, we are already working on desalination with Mexico, the United States and Mexico, under one of the recent minutes to the 1944 treaty with Mexico. I think our hope is that this will not stop with just let's build one plant and then that's it, that there need to be many of them. They're expensive and they take a long time. I could not give you an estimate for what a plant on the magnitude that Clint mentioned of 1 to 200,000 acre feet per year would cost, but it's in the billions of dollars to build something like that. So every option that we have going forward is more expensive than the supplies that we have now, which in large part, say, speaking of CAP water, the water is free. The cost is to move it to where it needs to be with the infrastructure and the electricity. So everything going forward is much more expensive than that. But yes, the United States is surrounded by water, so is Mexico, and that to many people is an obvious place to go. And the major impediment is how fast can you raise the money?
Yes, sir.
I'd like to just make people aware of the fact that the floodwater harvesting, which has been talked about a number of ways, the legislature in Arizona sent a letter to the Washington, D.C. asking them to do a feasibility study. Also, the conservation, unit did the very same thing. And what it really comes down to is they've got way too much water. We don't have enough water. And they have floods. They had $219 billion worth of damage in 2019. This last year, Davenport, Iowa, had 40 or 50,000 or $1 million worth of damage. And what we were looking at with the feasibility study is Interstate 80 runs from Davenport to Rock Springs. And if they would put a pipeline in, there's a lot of pipers with the Keystones thing that would like to work on that. But if they would pipe the water down, do diversion dams, pull that water off, that would keep the river from flooding as badly. It wouldn't stop it, but it would certainly be a good thing to have happen. And the water that would come down is from snowmelt. So that's what happens in Wisconsin, Minnesota. They keep getting wetter and colder, and it's going to happen every year.
They're taking our snow. That's what they're doing.
Yeah, they're taking your snow, and we can talk to them about that.
We should.
But as
like
they
your
say,
idea of taking the Keystone.
there's a lot of water available.
You're going to take the Keystone, instead of go north-south, it's
Yeah.
going to go east-west. Okay.
But what's planned is to run that to Rock Springs, put it in the Green River, and let it roll through the canyon into the reservoirs. Everything else to fill up water. Herb Gunther, who was somebody I thought knew more about water than anybody except God, and
Actually, there's a question. They're sort of tied.
I'm sorry.
The two of them are tied.
Oh, okay. Well, I got you. I think they probably are. He made a statement earlier on in some water law classes that without a new source of water, that our replenishment would never work, and that if we continue to pump the desert, we've got the Gobi Desert. And so basically, he said we need a new source of water, and that's what's being found out right now in Washington, D.C. with the feasibility study. Is that possible? So I wanted to just
Thank you, sir.
alert everybody.
Thank you. Next question.
Brian Carey, City Council, City of Page. So with every crisis, there's opportunities. What does CAP see as an opportunity in terms of mitigating transmission loss? Are there possibilities to create more water that's now currently lost along the transmission?
Thank you. Ted?
Yeah, there are always opportunities, and the question is how much does it cost to capture the opportunity? The transmission loss in the CAP Canal is relatively low compared to the quantity of water that is being transported. Our major loss on the CAP Canal is through evaporation, and that is both primarily in Lake Pleasant, but also from the canal. But the seepage is actually very low. It's about 1%. Which in absolute terms, 1% of 1.5 million acre feet per year is 15,000 acre feet. It sounds like a lot, but the effort and the cost to reduce that closer to zero is not worth it. And the Bureau of Reclamation did a very good job in designing the canal. It's completely concrete lined, and the seepage and the concrete is thick, so the actual loss from seepage is very low. That being said, there are lots of opportunities along the entire system. Colorado River, certainly all the way down to distribution at the local level for reducing losses.
Great. Thank you. City of Scottsdale.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I am Solange Whitehead with the City of Scottsdale City Council. So that ties in well with my question, the evaporation issue. And I think what our citizens need, and maybe this is something the state, although I think the state can help us provide, is we've heard about turf, and it sounds like Tucson's already taken care of it, so they need other ideas. So what about swimming pools? What about the water softeners? What about, I think what our residents need is a broader list of ideas of how their water is being lost. And industrial too, other uses. I think it would be really helpful to have, for everybody to have a list of who are the biggest users of our water and how can we all work together. In Scottsdale, one of our biggest uses is, for instance, the nuclear power plant. A large portion of our valuable wastewater goes there. So it's just kind of that kind of education beyond turf. That's what I would recommend. And thanks for everything on this panel.
Our municipal folks have any comments on that?
Just that I completely agree. You know, that's one of the workshops and the additional outreach that we do pretty regularly, the ABCs of water, and looking at how much water your swimming pool loses. That's going to be an even bigger issue, not even from evaporation, but as swimming pools age out and start cracking. You know, we've got a public pool right now that's using 4 times as much water as its partner in another location, and we're going to do a complete rehab on it. But as municipal or as residential pools start to fail and you start seeing that leakage, it's going to be just another sink, you know, another source of water loss. But all those different things, RO systems and soft water systems and everything, just kind of showing people, and then at this point, it's up to them to decide if that's something that they want to do or, continue to use or not. But in the future, as we get into future tiers and potential shortage or mandatory reductions in usage, then it's going to be less their choice and more a requirement, so.
Yeah, I filled in a pool, and it's a lovely sort of serpentine little lawn now. I don't necessarily recommend that, but it's one way to go. Now, we have 3 people in line. That's all we're going to be able to take. We're right at the end of our time. But please go ahead.
My name is Frank Savino. I'm with the town of Parker on the beautiful Colorado River. Anyhow,
we're trying to keep that river. That's what we're doing.
We're approximately 15 miles south of the intake for the CAP. And I grew up when the CAP was being built, when the tunnel was being put together for the intake from Lake Havasu. And I remember all the talk was done when the war between Arizona and California going on over the water itself and what is taking place. My younger brother worked for Metropolitan Water District until he retired over the last 5 years. And I was Public Works Director for the town of Parker for 25 years, and I've been in government, local government for 42 years, so there's a lot going on. Back in '83, we had the man-made floods because the Bureau of Reclamation thought that they really needed to drain the lakes, and it destroyed a lot of our shoreline, a lot of homes and what have you because of what they did. And because they miscalculated what had been transpired from what I could remember, that's why we've had the ongoing water shortage that we've had. They drain the lakes from above, and it's just been a terrible thing. If you've ever flown over the Colorado River at this point right now, you can see the diminishing line of flow. You get closer to Mexico, and it's almost a trickle of the river that we have. Also, in thinking about this whole situation, how many of you in the room here have been to Lake Mead lately? Just a small handful of people. You do not understand the magnitude of what these gentlemen and ladies are talking about unless you see what has transpired. I've been up in California and looked at Lake Shasta. When I was a youngster, we used to be able to water ski and do everything in Lake Shasta. Now you can almost walk across it. Lake Mead is getting to the point right now where the diminishing depth of the lake is definitely a problem.
Amen. Thank you, sir.
So,
absolutely.
Anyhow, I just wanted to make that statement. I appreciate all the hard work you're doing in trying to provide water for the Arizonans. I also served on the water banking committee back in the 80s with Grady Gamage and that, so I go back a little ways with that.
Thank you.
Star Bearcat from Quartzsite. All the all the saving for the water and the ways you're doing it's great. The one thing I'm not hearing is cutting demand by cutting population in the affected areas of the high demand from the cap. You have anything to say on that?
Sounds like a state issue, Clint.
Thanks, Terry. Well, I'm not going to say anything about the population growth, but we are having iterations of our management plans that we've been expediting, which we are ringing new levels of conservation with each succeeding plan. So we acted quickly on the remaining 4 MPs, and now we have the 5th management plans for all 5 AMAs under construction, and that will result in, after promulgated, it will result in additional conservation by sector, across the sectors, across the 5 AMAs. And so that's, what we've been endeavoring to do to help reduce that demand.
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, Good afternoon, President Goddard and panel. Henry Wade, City of Maricopa. I'm just curious, what, if any, responsibility does AWR have to the local communities to help them in educating the communities on what's taking place and the dangers that they face ahead of them.
So you're talking more big picture, kind of the broad brush, bigger issues, or are you like at the more granular level about how people can respond? Huh? Well, we do have education programs that we offer through our AMA section, including Project WET, that help to educate constituents, that provide education concerning conservation methods. And we have a drought coordinator who is readily available to provide presentations, and she can elaborate on some of the broader issues, but then help bring it down to the more local level about the ways in which communities can respond. And some of the content is somewhat broad. There is other elements that are more specific. With the management plans that I just had referred to, there are conservation requirements for the municipalities, and then the munis in turn implement, and then they have those localized efforts. I mean, basically, so they tailor those, adjust those to their particular circumstances, and so it's a combination. We have folks, we have resources that we can provide to help educate concerning the circumstances, big and small, but then and I think we have a good education program to help people with that question, because people want to know. I mean, they hear about what's happening. Sometimes it's just starting to grab one's attention. In other instances, anxiety levels go up, and they want to know, how can we answer? How can we respond? And so we have programs that are suited to that. And if you want to talk later, I can get your contact information and connect you with our team.
Just to pick up on that for a minute, AWR has a great website in terms of some good information that we can all use. CAP has a website at cap-az.com. And let me just do a shameless plug since I have the microphone. On the 29th of September at 9 a.m., we're doing an online CAP University. It's something we've been trying out for most of the year. I think we've got it right. It's going to deal with the shortage, the drought issues that we've talked about here today. So if you want to hear a broad panel on a longer period, I mean, I know that we can't possibly cover all the topics that we've touched on today in an hour, and we haven't quite succeeded. It's more than an hour now, and I've got to bring things to a close. But that CAP University you can sign up for on the CAP website, again, cap-az.com. And we're trying very hard to get the kind of information that we're struggling to present here as to how do we deal with an emergency without scaring people, without turning off the economy, but being responsible, making sure that Arizona faces this future in a realistic way. Because I know we can overcome this problem. We've done some worse ones in the past, but it's going to be a challenge for all of us. And city officials are going to be at the front lines, because that's where the water goes in large part, farms and cities. And what you can do with your populations is going to be critically important going forward. So we're all in this together. We need to find a unified support and a unified effort to try to figure out all the different ways that we can make sure that this precious water remains, we get as much out of it as we possibly can. Please help me thank this panel. I think they've done a fabulous job. Thank you very much. You're free to go now to the other recreations that the league has provided.